G'day everyone, David Wilson here for Zach's Place. This is Food for Thought, coming to you for Zach's Place Community Church, a church in Yarra Junction that serves to meet the needs of the community. And during this time of lockdown, we're bringing you some thoughts on the book of James. And we have been for a little while now, and we're up to James chapter 4, verses 13 to 17. Switch the video off and have a read of those verses. They're great verses. And then get right back. James has been talking about how we should live, and he's got a host of churches out there that he's caring for as pastor of these churches. And he's writing from Jerusalem in a time of persecution and suffering. And one of the biggest questions is how should we live? You know, here we are as God's people in the midst of some really hard times. How should we live? And we've noticed over the weeks in the chapters that go before this one, how he's handled a lot of different daily situations. And in these verses in James chapter 4, we see him approaching some everyday evils that perhaps we don't often think about in the church. And, you know, when I use the word evil, I'm talking about the opposite of good. And good is defined as anything that helps God's way to be fulfilled. And so evil is actually anything that's opposed to God's way, whether it be in ourselves, in our communities, in our society. It's evil if it's not fitting in with God's ways, because we believe, our presupposition is that God's ways are the right ways, and so good fits in with that, and evil is that which doesn't. And oftentimes when evil is used, we think of perhaps the extremes of evil, you know, stuff that's just really bad news, like sexual abuse and domestic violence and injustices and so forth. And that's certainly evil because it's opposed to God's way. But there are other everyday evils that perhaps we don't give a whole lot of thought to, and James does, and he challenges us to do just that. So in these verses, he talks about two evils, everyday evils, essentially. The first one is an arrogance that we have when we plan ahead with surety, and this includes business planning. Those of you who say, tomorrow I'm going to do this, and the next day I'm going to do that, and then so on, and have our plans all laid out for us, he says this is actually arrogance, because we don't even know what tomorrow holds. How can we be so arrogant to think that we can control the future? And that's what a lot of this planning, he says, that's what a lot of this planning sounds like. It sounds like you think you can control the future because you've decided all these things. And that's arrogant. You don't control the future. He said all future planning needs to come in the humility of acknowledging God's will. But that's an unknown. You know, what is God's will? What is God's plan for the future? He says we don't really know, and so it's arrogant to pretend like we're definitely going to do this and that and the other thing when we really don't know what tomorrow holds. Anything apart from that, he says, is boastful and arrogant, which makes it evil, makes it opposed to God's way of doing things. That's the first one, future planning and the arrogance of pretending like we can control the future, because we can't. The second thing that he mentions in these verses as an everyday evil are sins of omission. Get a rare mention. You know, we usually think about sinning, about doing evil, as acts of evil. You know, violence and anger that's out of control. As I mentioned before, you know, abuse and lying and slander and, you know, all that sort of stuff that is doing things that are evil, doing things that are opposed to God's way. But what he's saying here is that if you know that it's right to do something and you don't do it, well, that's evil as well. That's a sin, what we call a sin of omission. Sin is not confined to acts of evil. It's also applied to omitting to do good. So that's what he's talking about, everyday evils. So let's reflect on that. You know, oftentimes as far as the future planning is concerned, you might hear various Christians saying, if it's the Lord's will, I will do this and I will do that. But That's just at many times it's just a trite formula. It's just a way of saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, but you add that little bit on if it's the Lord's will. Oftentimes it's just a cliche. And I think James is talking about something quite different to just adding on a little cliche of if it's the Lord's will. He's really talking about an attitude of humility that admits, I really don't know what will happen in the future. You see, he's having a go at arrogance here, not just saying things about the future, but he's having a go at arrogance. And what's the antidote, if you like, for arrogance? It's humility. And so he's really saying that we need to be humble about the future and about our own plans and so forth. And I just wonder how such an attitude would affect our church planning. We're pretty good in the church at sitting down and planning out the year ahead, having 5-year plans and so forth. And sometimes it really borders on arrogance, as if saying, we know what the future holds and this is what we're going to do. There's been a post floating around Facebook for a few weeks now that declares if any of us were asked in 2015 where we would see ourselves in 5 years' time, none of us would get it right. COVID-19 has shown us that it's reminded us of the truth of James' teaching here about the foolishness of thinking that we know the future and that we can control the future, because we certainly wouldn't have picked it 5 years ago that we would be in lockdown within metropolitan Melbourne on this particular day. So much for our forward planning and so much for our 5-year goals. We've really got to be much more humble with our talking about the future than that, as far as James is concerned. That's what he's calling us to. Reflecting on the idea of the sins of omission. When the church fails to do good, then it is guilty of sin. When it fails to do that which is in line with God's purposes, it's guilty of evil, of sin. And in this world in which we live, this world of systemic evil, increased social problems all around us, on our doorsteps, when we choose to not speak up, and when we choose to not take a stand, and when we choose to not use opportunities that are given to us to do that which is right, then we're failing to do good. And that's what evil is all about. These are sins of omission, omitting to do the things that God has called us to. So as we always do, we look at Jesus' teaching and Jesus' life. We say, is this in line with the Gospels? Is this in line with what Jesus is talking about? Jesus unwraps this teaching on future planning as one who does know the will of God. He knew the will of God, and oftentimes the prophets in the Old Testament, for instance, knew the will of God, and they spoke accordingly, and they lived accordingly. And of course, that's not arrogance on Jesus' part. It wasn't arrogance on the prophet's part. It was more discernment. So there's a big difference, isn't there, between the arrogance of saying, I know what's going to happen, and the discernment that says, I can see God at work here. And this is where God is heading because this is what God has revealed, especially in his word in the Bible. There's a big difference between arrogance and discernment. And Jesus was discerning about the future and lived life accordingly. There are some things that we really do know the will of God about. I know it's God's will that we love one another. I know it's God's will that we forgive one another. It's really clear stuff in the Bible. And so because we know it's God's will to love one another, to forgive one another, to act in grace and mercy, for instance, we should plan for that because that's discernment. That's not arrogance. But that's not the sort of stuff that James is talking about here. James is talking about a different scenario where business planning and planning for the future involves controlling the future, and as if we can do that. So very different between the discernment that Jesus lived because he knew God's will for the future, the discernment that we can have because we know God's way in those things that have been made very clear to us, such as loving one another. Big difference between all that and the arrogance that James is talking about here, that says we can control the future. So we're going to do this, and we're going to do that, and we're going to do these other things, and just sit back and watch us. That's what James is saying we shouldn't be doing. Now, what about Jesus and the sins of omission? Well, I know that Matthew 25, I mention Matthew 25 a whole lot when I speak. It's a passage that is one of my favourites because it keeps on calling me back to the priorities that Jesus was on about. It's a great example of this problem of sins of omission, because Jesus declared very clearly in Matthew 25 that for people to neglect looking after those in need are guilty of neglecting the needs that he himself has. He said, as you didn't show compassion to these, the least of my brothers and sisters, you didn't do it for me. That's sins of omission. That's very challenging teaching right there. So how do we apply it? What does that mean for today? Well, everyday evils are oftentimes not on our minds, not really aware of them. Evils such as not doing the right thing and arrogant planning that boasts an ability to control the future. Well, these evils need to be addressed, James is saying. They need to be addressed in our lives. I need to address them. Zach's place, we need to address them. We all need to have a look at these everyday evils, everyday things that cause God's way to be pushed aside. The church is called to be a community of faith, embedded in our neighbourhoods, committed to being light in darkness. And this needs to include a humility rather than arrogance, and a commitment to doing what is right rather than simply an avoidance of doing what is wrong. And may that be the case with Open Door at Zach's Place in our community. God bless you. Thanks for listening. If you want to get on to me, davidroachwilson@gmail.com. David Roach, R-O-A-C-H, Wilson @gmail.com. Look forward to hearing from you if that's what you want to do. Until then, see ya.